this week's Technique Tuesday video, I'll demonstrate two variations of the round sock toe, as well as explain how to modify this toe based on different row gauges and different desired toe lengths. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. The round toe has 7 decrease rounds that are separated by plain rounds. Regardless of how many stitches you have on the needle, you will always have 7 decrease rounds. And the number of multiples you have will determine how many actual decreases per round you have. So if you have 64 stitches, you're going to have 8 decreases per round because you will have 8 multiples of 8 stitches. If you have 40 stitches, you're going to have 5 multiples of 8 stitches, and so you will have 5 decreases per round. So you always have the same number of decrease rounds. That doesn't change. And the number of decreases that you are working per round will tell you the number of stitches that you will have after the last decrease round, and that's the number of stitches that you will fasten off at the end. You don't graft the toe shut. Instead, you fasten the stitches, the live stitches off in the same way that you would fasten off a hat. So because you are always working the same number of decrease rounds, and those decrease rounds are separated by plain rounds, you can work the toe in different ways in order to produce toes that are different lengths. So this is a short round toe that has only 19 rounds. I worked 2 plain rounds after every decrease round. And for this toe, this is a long round toe. For this toe, you work more plain rounds than you do for this one. That's why it's longer. And the way that the plain rounds are distributed is that you start with quite a few plain rounds, and then you gradually reduce the number of plain rounds after each decrease round until you get to the end. So you have these two basic formulas for how these toes are worked, but it can be varied in order to get a very specific toe length. Because the decrease rounds for these toes are worked in a very specific way, that means that if your stitches are larger, if you are working at a larger gauge, that means that they're longer too. And so the 19 rounds of this short toe, round toe, is going to vary in length depending on how large your stitches are. If you don't have a multiple of 8 stitches on the needle, then you need to work a round that decreases out the extra stitches. If I had 44 stitches, for example, I would need to work a round where I did 4 decreases, I space them out evenly as I can until I was down to the 40 stitches I actually do have here. With 40 stitches, that is 5 multiples of 8 stitches. So I need to divide up these stitches into 5 sets of 8. The best way of doing that is to make sure that every needle ends with a multiple of 8. Because I've got 5 multiples and I've only got 2 needles, I'm going to have 2 multiples of 8 on one needle, and then I'm going to put 3 multiples on the other. So I'm going to count off in sets of 8, and then I'm going to put a locking stitch marker in between. So I have 8 stitches here, and then I need the next set of 8. And instead of putting a marker here, because I only need to have 2 repeats here, I'm just going to pull my cable out for my magic loop to separate those out so that I don't need to put a marker at the end of the needle. If you're using double pointed needles, you can just distribute them. You might have uneven numbers on each double point, but just make sure you have full multiples of 8 on each of your double pointed needles. So now on this needle, I've got the remaining stitches, so I'm going to have 3 sets of 8 on this needle. And again, I don't need a marker at the end of the needle because I'll know that that is the end of one of the multiples. That you're going to knit 6 stitches and then you're going to knit 2 together. But because we have the markers here, we can also just say knit until 2 stitches remain before the marker and then knit those 2 together. But it is knit 6, knit 2 together all the way around. So the more stitches you have, the more times you will be working this repeat. After you have finished your decrease round, if you're working a short round toe, you'd work 2 plain rounds after the first decrease round. But if you're working a long round toe, you'd work 6 rounds after the first decrease round. And the way you can remember that is that you did knit 6, knit 2 together all the way around. And so now you're going to knit 6 rounds. So I've worked my 2 plain rounds, and for the short round toe, then I'm ready to work my next decrease round. And so the next decrease round is going to be knit 5, knit 2 together all the way around. Or if you are using the markers, the easy way to do that is to knit until you get 2 stitches from the marker and then knit 2 together. So this is going to happen every decrease round. You're going to have 1 stitch fewer in here each time. So this second decrease round is knit 5, knit 2 together. The third decrease round is knit 4, knit 2 together. The fourth decrease round is knit 3, knit 2 together, etc. And so the very last decrease round, that decrease round number 7, is simply going to be knit 2 together all the way around, and then you'll have just 1 stitch left for each of these original multiples of 8 that you started with. So for the short round toe, you always are working 2 plain rounds after each decrease round, except for the very last decrease round. You don't work any plain rounds. But for the long round toe, as I mentioned, you'd be working 6 plain rounds after the first decrease round. So this time when you work knit 5, knit 2 together, then you'd work 5 plain rounds after each one. So let's talk about how you can tell how many plain rounds you have worked since the last decrease. We know that we worked our decrease right before the marker, and so you can see that this single stitch that's next to the marker has a stitch below it and then another single stitch below it, and then but below that you can see that there's this double stitch. So you can see that's where the decrease is. This stitch right here is lying on top of that stitch, and then you can see coming from these 2 stitches there are 2 separate columns of stitches. So that's when the decrease was worked, and then you count above that decrease that there were 2 rounds. So that's how you can keep track of how many rounds you've actually worked since the previous decrease. And then you know that these 2 stitches are the decrease, the stitches that will be decreased together, and by counting the stitches before that, you can tell, oh, I'm going to be doing a knit 5, a knit 2 together. Just finished the last decrease round, so now I cut the yarn and I threaded a yarn needle, and now I'm going to fasten off the stitches. And again, there's no grafting. You just slip the stitches to the yarn needle as you would if you were fastening off a hat. And then you can cinch that closed. I tend to like to go around a second time. Keeps it from stretching open into a hole. And then you can just insert it right down inside the center of that hole. So this is a little bit pointy because you are continuing to work 2 rounds to 2 plain rounds after every round all the way up to the very end. This can get a little pointy. So what you might want to do instead is eliminate those plain rounds after the last few decrease rounds and only work decrease rounds, and that will kind of round it off a little bit more. This is the short round toe version, and it's the same, basically it's the same size foot, but the toe is quite a bit longer. In fact, it's probably even longer than this long toe. And the reason is because these are larger stitches, and so they take up more vertical space than these tinier stitches. So part of the decision about whether to make a short round toe or a long round toe is the size of your stitches and the length of the toe that you actually need. When you're looking at the foot and determining where to start the toe, you want to start it at the point where the foot is actually getting smaller. And so for my friend Helen, this is right at the top of her little toe. It's going to be a longer toe than for my friend Rosemary, whose foot starts to get smaller right here where her big toe splits from her second toe and her ball of foot gets narrower and her little toe comes in here. So for her, she might need a toe that's 1 3/4 inches, but my friend Helen might need a toe that's 2.5 inches long. So I can use my row gauge to figure out, well, how long is a 2.5-inch toe? Or I can take a ruler and measure the foot that I'm actually knitting and say, well, how many rounds are there in 2.5 inches? I can do that either way. So I need to know how many rounds long I want my toe to be, and then I can figure out how many plain rounds I need in between all of my decrease rounds, and then I can make some decisions about how I want to distribute them. You can kind of do this manually. So you have decrease rounds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. There are no plain rounds after the 7th round. You only put plain rounds after the 1st through 6th. And so if you need 20 rounds altogether, well, 7 of the rounds will be decreased rounds, and then you need to distribute the other 13 rounds between here. And you can do it evenly if you want, or you can do more rounds at this end and fewer rounds at this end. Because like, as I mentioned, it can get a little pointy if you make them evenly distributed all the way. So you can do this manually and kind of figure out how you want to distribute them, or you can do what I do and use a spreadsheet. So when you click on the link to see the spreadsheet, you're going to see a page that looks like this. You're going to click on Make a Copy, and then you'll get a copy of the calculator showing up. And so I'm going to show you a few things, and then you can play with it on your own. So the things that are highlighted in green are the things that you're going to fill out. You're going to enter in your row gauge over 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So let's say you have 12 rounds per inch. That's 48. You can put that in there. Let's say you have 72 stitches. And let's say you want to make a toe length that is 2.5 inches long. So this in blue tells you how many rounds long your toe needs to be in order to hit 2.5 inches. And this number right here, this 9, is telling you how many decreases per round you're going to be working. That's how many multiples of 8 there are in 72 stitches. So you'll be doing 9 decreases every round. And when you work your final round of knit 2 together all the way around, you're going to have 9 stitches left to fasten off. If you do not have a multiple of 8 stitches, then this will tell you how your setup round, how many stitches you need to work. So if I change the number of stitches I have, let's say I have 76 stitches, then I'm going to have to work a setup round of 4 decreases before I can begin working my round toe. So let's go back to 72 stitches. And what you'll see here in the center is the formulas for both the short round toe and the long round toe. So for the short round toe, the formula will always give you 19 rounds, regardless of how many stitches you have, because the number of decreases per round will vary based on the number of stitches you have. So you will always have 19 rounds. And what this is telling you is, well, how long is 19 rounds going to be? Given your row gauge. And you can see here that it's only 1.5 inches, and you would have to add 11 rounds in here in order to get yourself a toe that's 2.5 inches long. The long round toe, on the other hand, is 28 rounds long, and so we're already at a pretty good start. It would be 2.33 inches in length if we just worked it to the formula. So we would need to add a couple of rows. So we can either add a couple of rows here in order to get our 30 rounds that we need, or we could just choose to work a couple of extra plain rounds before we started the toe. You could do either way. If you think it'll work for your foot to just start the toe a couple of rounds later, you could do that, or you could change the number of rounds here. So instead of working 6 rounds, you could work 7, and instead of working 5 rounds, then you could work 6. So it's the yellow highlighted places is where you change the number of plain rounds. This area right here tells you what that decrease round, how it's worked, which is true for the short round toe or the long round toe. So you can play with these number of plain rounds that are highlighted in yellow to watch the formula change so that it will match the toe length that you actually need. So if we put in the row gauge of the sample that I knit for you, I had 40 stitches. I need a 2-inch toe, so that would have been 14 rounds. And so that's why my toe ended up so long, because I knit it to the formula, and I actually needed to eliminate 5 of the rounds. I really should have only worked a single plain round after each of those decrease rounds in order for the short round toe to work out for me. When you're adding rows of plain rows or decreasing rows, it's the best approach is to add rows starting at the base of the toe if you need to add a few. If you need to eliminate some, start at the tip of the toe so that you don't get that pointiness. So that's the approach for that. So for me to work a short round toe over those bigger stitches, I really needed to not have so many plain rounds between my decrease rounds. The round toe can accommodate a variety of toe shapes, allowing you to add or eliminate those plain rounds in order to match the shape of your toes. If you'd like to play with the round toe calculator spreadsheet, there's a link down in the video description. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.